I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week we're going to be breaking down the career of Steve McQueen. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about movie stars and what makes them great. Essentially, the structure of the show is as follows. The sort of first two-thirds of the video, I talk about the sort of career arc of the actor by breaking down their career into three distinct chapters. In those chapters, I talk about a defining role and talk about that movie a bit, just to help you understand where they were in their career, how their career evolved, how they did different things, how they sort of defined their persona. And in the sort of last half of the video, the last third, I talk about that defining feature. What is that one thing that they were able to bring that is not necessarily an acting technique or a role that they played, but sort of a distinct feature that they had that made them a movie star, that sort of unique thing that they had that no one else had, that they utilized to sort of ultimately become this big movie star. We've done a bunch of movie stars so far, old and new. This one's a little bit more older. I hope you appreciate that. It's a little bit of a history lesson, which is sort of in part one reason why I like to do these videos, because I get to see a lot of these great actors, movies that I haven't seen before, while also rewatching a lot of movies and sort of just trying to understand their career. And Steve McQueen is a really interesting one because his career didn't necessarily end off in the perfect place. You know, dies tragically at 50 before his career is really over. But despite that, has had such a terrific career and so many varying types of movies that I thought it was still applicable. And because he's one of those guys that I always knew about, and I sort of saw the Great Escape and the Bullits, but I hadn't done sort of a true deep dive in his career. So going into his career, watching a lot of his movies really helped me sort of understand him and appreciate him and really understand why he was so effective and so appreciated for his time. So just starting off now into the first chapter of his career, I'm calling this chapter the Ultra Competitor, because he sort of did a very typical leading man or actor kind of a route in terms of his rise to fame and to Hollywood and to stardom. That he didn't start off, in theater or whatnot, or start off out of the gate really hot. He started off in B movies, being the lead of a movie like The Blob, and then sort of slowly started to do more supporting roles, and then get something like The Magnificent Seven, and which is this great opportunity. The movie's really good, but he's also very good in it, and sort of almost steals the movie from a Yul Brynner. And then when he actually does get his leading man roles, he really exceeds with that. But I'm calling this period the sort of ultra competitor because it sort of bleeds into his early leading man career, while also being his supporting career as well. So I'm talking about the 50s, or if you want to start with 1960s, Magnificent Seven, and then you go onwards to, I'd sort of end the cutoff point at 65 with the Cincinnati Kid, because either he's doing supporting roles or he's part of an ensemble going up against legendary actors like a James Garner or an Edward G. Robinson, and he's sort of going toe-to-toe with them before he becomes sort of the true lone wolf Steve McQueen action movie kind of guy that we see later on. But I'm jumping ahead. This sort of first chapter is the Ultra Competitor because he has a sort of different type of acting style that we don't see too often, and it's particularly his approach to acting based on all the stories that we hear, is that he wasn't always the most collaborative of people, that he did sort of see acting in his role and stardom as a competition, as a sort of sport, in the sense that he wanted to win, he wanted to be the number one billed man, he wanted to be the leading guy. Even in the supporting roles, he was trying to do everything to make his sort of part worthwhile. And then even more so in terms of the roles that he's taking, whether it be something like the Cincinnati Kid, where he is this up-and-coming poker player who wants to win, or the Great Escape, he has this antagonistic relationship early on with some of the other inmates, and of course that antagonistic relationship between him and the guards. There's always him against somebody else. Even in the Magnificent Seven, he's still sort of had reticent to sort of give over and join the team. He's a little bit more of his lone wolf in that sense. So he's always trying to make his part interesting and unique and different, even if he's in a supporting role. Steve McQueen as the actor is just trying to make it as interesting as possible. But also the characters that he's playing and the characters that he's successful at have this sort of anti-authoritarian, antagonistic sort of myself against the world competitive kind of a nature that we don't always see, because when we hear about actors talk, it's all about the collaborative process and sharing and improv and going back and forth between one another. But Steve McQueen sort of had this unique kind of style, which I think also bled into the types of roles he played and the types of roles he was good at. So in this early period, I'm calling it the ultra competitor because of the types of roles he plays, but also because of the sort of acting approach that he had. And then when talking about the definitive feature of this movie, the definitive role, I thought I was going to go with The Great Escape, but I think I'm going to go here with the Cincinnati Kid. Saw this for the very first time in preparation for this video. He plays up-and-coming poker player, the Cincinnati Kid, who wants to challenge the sort of established poker player in the town known as the Man, and we sort of see him as he sort of tries to get a shot, and then his preparation for that shot, and then finally the actual shot that he has with the Man and the sort of duel that they have in this poker match. And this really does feel in many ways like a strong Western. He's, of course, starts with The Magnificent Seven, but I think sort of eventually morphs into doing more sort of modern day kind of pieces, more sort of urban movies. However, even in that case, whether it be the Bullitt or Cincinnati Kid, there is sort of a Western sort of type of persona that we see within this movie. But what's maybe even more indicative in this movie is that I consider a very early sports movie. You know, he really hasn't done any other sports movies aside from something like Le Mans, which is a little bit more experimental, but the sports movie really works well for his persona because he is this guy who always sort of thinks he's being counted out, always thinks he's the underdog, wants to prove himself against other people, that sort of tough grit that he's got to him. So of course the Cincinnati Kid being this up-and-coming player, of course mirroring the sense that he's being an up-and-coming actor going against a legend, in this case Edward G. Robinson. I think McQueen's performance of being ultra cool and confident and wanting to challenge the Man is of course perfectly echoing his actual movie star persona, and which ultimately helps when you understand McQueen's career to watch the Cincinnati Kid. But even on its own merits, I think the way Norman Jewison photographs this movie, this is really one of the best movies I've ever seen in terms of utilizing the close-up. It really does feel like a spaghetti western in that sense, where we have these extreme close-ups, and it's just about this battle of the wits. It's about reactions. It's about what you're not saying. It's about the sort of looking down between the men. Of course, the movie really exceeds in these poker scenes where you don't really need to totally understand the rules of poker. You just have to understand the sort of stakes, that this is the up-and-comer. He's going up against the main guy. He wants to win sort of the proper way versus some of the cheating that's happening behind the scenes, and he tries to do it with sort of honor and authenticity, and that's sort of ultimately what the movie is about. It's about not really poker or winning money, but about winning respect, and about who you are, and the sort of obsession that he has, that obsession at the sacrifice of some of his relationships, and that dynamic we've seen in movies for many years since, and this is sort of in many ways an origin story of a sports movie, of a man on a mission, obsessed kind of a movie. It's brilliantly photographed and told by Norman Jewison, but of course also allows McQueen, because of these close-ups, to show off his acting skills and to show off his great on-screen persona, while also mirroring his movie star sort of persona of a guy who wants to be great, who will do everything to be great. And I think it allows McQueen to sort of utilize his real-life persona in the best way possible. So many of these great movies we talk about utilize their movie stars' best quality to the success of the movie, and that's why we like them, and that's why we like the movie, and that's why we like the movie stars. So there's sort of a duality there as well. Then chapter 2, I'm calling this one The Lone Wolf, because early on in his career he has these ensemble movies, or he has these movies where he's the lead, like A Great Escape or Cincinnati Kid, but there's so many other actors to the movie. There are scenes where he's doing sort of showdowns between other serious actors. It's always, maybe he's the lead, but he's still sort of part of an ensemble. Whereas in the sort of later period, which I'd say starts off with 66 in The Sand Pebbles, where he gets his first and only nomination, where he's terrific in it, but he's very much a lone wolf, independent type. That's what the sort of structure of the movie is around. And even from then on, whether we're talking about movies like Bullitt, or I'd extend it all the way into The Getaway, he is sort of an actor, or Thomas Crown Affair, where he is the main actor. They have supporting people around him, but they're not really of Steve McQueen's stature, and if they are, they're sort of the female lead, like an Ali MacGraw, versus sort of a legendary male actor that he did early on in his career. So I call this one the Lone Wolf just because it's Steve McQueen on the poster. He's the main draw. You see the Sam Pebbles poster, it's just him. You see The Getaway. Many times it's him with big titles and a gun. I've been mentioning someone like Ali MacGraw. I mean, even a movie like Le Mans, many of the actors in the movie are non-professionals. They're race car drivers. And, I don't even want to talk about the career of Steve McQueen, the race car driver, because we're just talking about acting here, but he's got that whole other side of his career too, which is fascinating. But in this period, I call it the Lone Wolf because those are the type of movies that he's sort of drawn to, where there's not sort of another actor that he can compete against. He starts to get a little bit more interested in the Steve McQueen picture, and we get that for better or for worse. That is the sort of persona that he ultimately has devised, and I think a terrific example of that defining persona that he created is Bullitt. Now, talking about the movie is also in part talking about this period of Steve McQueen, just because by now we know what a Steve McQueen movie is, and particularly I think in these lone wolf kind of movies, we understand and really define the Steve McQueen persona. That he is someone that is ultra cool, that knows how to take a punch, knows how to give one, and knows how to drive a car, and is competent and is totally in control of all the things he does. Thomas Crown Affair is another example where he's totally in control of that movie. But I think Bullitt is the best case scenario of that, because sometimes that doesn't work and it becomes a little bit stale. But I think Bullitt is a great example of it working because of the excellent action sequences that we see, and because of the sort of simplistic but effective man on a mission type story. That this is Steve McQueen playing a San Francisco cop, appropriately named Bullitt, where he is the executor of justice. It's very much, in my opinion, an American film in the sense that it's about freedom and not necessarily always trusting the system and doing it yourself if you want to get a job done. And you have this sort of super cop that is terrific at doing this job, and he's going to execute on doing that, and that's our sort of plan. That the unfairness of the crime world has destroyed the judicial process, so now Steve McQueen's Bullitt has to take it in his own hands and execute it. And he's so great in this movie because he's so interested in being cool, that actors nowadays aren't always interested in being cool in the same way Steve McQueen is, but he's got that sort of natural charisma and charm and confidence that makes him feel cool. But what I was also surprised in this movie is just the sort of little things that he accentuates to allow himself to be or be perceived as cooler, in the sense that he has very few lines of dialogue, and if he does, he sort of says them in sort of a short, stoic, abrupt, abrasive kind of a way. Therefore, when he does speak, we listen, and when he does speak, the events of the movie generally happen. When he says something, people listen, and therefore his words become so much more impactful, and therefore it allows him to seem like he's very much more in control of the movie. But then even in instances, of course, you have the classic car chase scene, just the way he walks into the car, the way he walks getting to the car and then gets into the car, or even the airport shootout at the end. If you look at just how he shoots the gun, it's not the sort of double-handed squat shooting like a cop maybe would in real life. It's the one hand out, sort of to the side, kind of duel-esque almost shooting style, which probably isn't very practical, but he understood the ability to look cool, to look great, whether it be the style, the fashion, the cars. The Bullitt is the sort of ultimate Steve McQueen movie, probably his most recognizable movie, because of the persona that he crafted outside of movies, but also within his movies, ultimately represented of this ultimate badass guy who will execute justice, who will be on the right side, who will get it done, this sort of fantasy of a sort. But McQueen is the representation of that, and whether it be his sort of cool, confident walk to his car, the way he sort of strangely but coolly shoots his gun, his style, his fashion, the way he carries himself in this movie, the way he gives himself few lines of dialogue, his looks, certain things like that really execute, I think, on his movie star persona, particularly within this movie here in Bullitt. Then in chapter 3, I'm going to call this chapter The Collaborator, because in many years of doing his lone wolf kind of persona, we sort of see a couple of movies here later on in his career where he starts to collaborate with other people. He's getting a little bit older. He's still interested in being the lead, but he's interested in sort of doing more two-handers, very much overt two-handers, in the sense that he'll do Papillion in 73 with Dustin Hoffman. You could even say 72's Getaway. The Getaway is sort of a classic, maybe Collaborator, an example, just in the sense that Ali MacGraw is coming off Love Story, she's a big star, and Steve McQueen's like, hey, I want to work with you. I don't want to do another Bullitt where it's just me. I don't want to do Le Mans where it's all non-professional actors. I want to work with someone that is, big. And 72, I think, sort of maybe is the first one, but definitely 73 with Papillion. And of course, 74, The Towering Inferno. He's second billed, but slightly higher in the sort of position on the poster than Paul Newman, which is its own sort of interesting story in that case. But despite the fact that, if you look at the movie itself, he's working with Paul Newman, he's working with a legendary actor, he's working in these sort of great ensemble. So there is sort of, I think, in the chapter, which was sort of unfortunately abruptly short because of his death, and a genuine interest in working with great actors, in sort of collaborating with them, in terms of, hey, there's this Dustin Hoffman kid, he's a great up-and-coming actor, I want to work with him, I want to work with Ali MacGraw, oh, I have a chance to work with Paul Newman, yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to take another movie that doesn't have me working with these people. I'm going to actually collaborate with these people and work with great actors. And, even though we got sort of cut a little bit short, he has a 4-year hiatus, dies a couple years after that, this was sort of the most clear example, I think, of this sort of late period. And then when talking about a defining role, I've already did a whole video talking about The Towering Inferno, so I didn't want to pick that one, so I decided to pick Papillion, which is a fascinating movie because for a guy like Steve McQueen, who has crafted his on-screen persona as being cool, as being confident, as being an executor of tasks, it's fascinating to see Papillion be a movie about failure, about trying to escape and not being able to, and sort of ultimately being a man who is punished many times throughout the movie. But despite that, he still succeeds in the movie because the movie shifts from becoming a successful escape movie in the sense of like The Great Escape, but now it becomes a sense of perseverance movie. It becomes a will movie. How strong is this man's will? Will he do something to rat out to his fellow members for less weeks? How sort of dedicated will he be? How many times will he try before his spirit gets broken? So it's a great jail movie. It's also a great buddy kind of friendship movie. I mean, there's a real sort of, he has real chemistry with Dustin Hoffman and sells his dramatic scenes, which he hasn't really done in a serious way, in my opinion, since something like The Sand Pebbles, where he really is great here in a truly dramatic role. But then also, of course, it still helps because it still helps the Steve McQueen persona, because even though he's failing, even though he's not escaping, he's persevering in the sense of these sort of overwhelming and unfair punishments that he's being put upon in this French colony jail. So a classic sort of late period role because I think it's a classic representation of his legacy. Even though he died a few years later of an unfortunate disease, this is the Steve McQueen we want to remember. A guy who can deal with everything. A guy that a disease couldn't take him down. He'd fight to the very last inch. That he's a guy who would persevere, who is genuinely tough and cool and confident and is not fake and is not trying to be cool. He just is. And that's why I think this Papillion movie is a classic example, because it's not necessarily super actiony. It's very much more drama focused, but that being said, it's still genre based and it's still a representation of those Steve McQueen ideals that he's been trying to represent. And then his defining feature, I've called this video Steve McQueen, the coolest man of all time, because I really do think he's probably the coolest movie star persona. He's not necessarily the toughest, which he is tough. He's not necessarily the most physically imposing, but he is slick, he is cool, and he knows it. And on one part, that was something that wasn't completely designed. How he shoots the gun, how he walks the car, what clothes are he wearing, how is he perceived within the movies. That was designed by McQueen. He wanted to look cool in Magnificent Seven to sort of lead Yul Brynner. But then also, there's sort of a natural charisma that he has to it because of his competitive nature, because of his competitive spirit and style to acting. But what's fascinating about him is that he's sort of a relic, because if you look at modern day action heroes or just superheroes or leading men, there's always sort of a certain sense of winking and a certain sense of irony that someone will throw a punch, but if you don't do this afterwards, if you don't go, ow, therefore it doesn't have that same impact. You have to sort of do that ow to get this sort of sympathy and audience reaction, to make it more relatable, to sort of allow the audience to go, hey, I know what I'm doing. I know that we sort of all have watched movies before, and I can't just punch someone without sort of doing one of these. Now, some people, I think, have to do that just because of the way they look. You know, The Rock doesn't always do that because he looks like The Rock, but Ryan Reynolds would have to do that. And in one sense, it's an effective way to get the audience on your side, but it's also sort of a cheap and easy way to sort of undercut moments. And therefore, when we're talking about dramatic moments, or if you actually want to look cool, you can never totally buy it because he's the same guy who sort of went like this after a punch. But Steve McQueen's not that like that, which is fascinating watching his movies, because I've sort of been conditioned to think of the action hero as at least somewhat self-referential or somewhat winking. And even something like Bruce Willis, you know, he's still an everyday guy doing these actions. But Steve McQueen is sort of maybe the last gasp of the true cool action star. I want to look cool. I don't want to have any sort of self-referential. I don't want to sort of humanize myself maybe in any way. I want to be sort of the fantasy that people go to the movies for. That's the fantasy of ultimately what I do, rather than sort of a relatable honesty that maybe certain movies nowadays try to achieve. So how does he do that? What is that defining feature that he's able to be so cool? Well, like I said, on one part, it's just something that he naturally has, the confidence, the charisma, the competitive style of acting. But it's also very carefully manicured. In something like The Magnificent Seven, he will creep into the background of scenes and be doing something, be doing some activity that looks like he's competent, you know, shooting a gun, preparing things, flipping his gun, looking at his belt. He's always looking like he's busy, like he's doing something, like he's someone who's important, and that's the stuff he does in supporting roles. But in many of his lead roles, he has such a control over how his story is told that he's very much like a modern day actor producer type of a guy, where he is interested in crafting his own image. So that means if there's a lot of speeches or dialogue in the movie, he's cutting it out, because he knows the less words you say, the more impactful those words become ultimately, and allows him, of course, to do less talking, do more action scenes and more stunt work, which he very much appreciated, but also because he knew that it was also more of his strength. Now, that's not to say he couldn't act. He's shown that he can act, and I think Papillion and the Sand Pebbles, and even something like the Cincinnati Kid. But he's interested just to be that persona. So he does have this cool persona, in part because he's interested in action scenes first, sort of dialogue second, but understanding the impact of those dialogue scenes. Always interested in implementing sort of realism in his movies, and oftentimes that means him behind the car. If it's in a race car scene, or you know, in Le Mans, he's doing a lot of that stunts himself, or if he's shooting a gun, it's him really shooting the gun. So he carefully manicures the sense that, hey, if I'm actually able to do a lot of this stunt work, I'm able to give this movie a sense of realism that maybe it didn't otherwise have, and therefore add to my sort of persona of, hey, that's actually Steve McQueen doing it. That's not an actor. That's a guy who is seriously doing these stuff. In the same way we look at Tom Cruise today in Top Gun Maverick, there's sort of an appreciation and a coolness just because, hey, that guy's actually really doing it. So it's the lack of dialogue, it's the way he carries himself as well, the manicured way of how he shoots a gun, of how he walks, but then also the clothes, the fashion, the cars, bleeding into his real life persona and going to parties and being famous that way too. And there is a sense of realism in a lot of his movies, which I think adds to the realism of his persona, but it's everything that he is. It's the way he walks, it's the way he shoots a gun, whether it be manicured or whether that be how he actually is. Whatever he's doing on screen is personally chosen by Steve McQueen to look cool. So therefore his defining feature is looking cool. That's what he's best at doing. And when I think of a Steve McQueen movie, I think of one word, and that is cool. So when I talk about his defining feature, when I talk about a Steve McQueen picture, that's what he is, and that's his movie star magic. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Steve McQueen. What are your favorite videos? What are your favorite movies of his? If you want to check out my Towering Inferno video, just search, Towering Inferno, Connor Old. Did a couple years ago, but people seem to really like that video, so check that one out if you want to hear more Steve McQueen talk. Next week, we're going to be talking about Al Pacino, and I think next after that is Paul Rudd. But that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.